Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our second Civil Rights Movement content lecture. Today, we are going to do a little bit of review from your energizers or your journals, and then we'll jump into more of the content stuff. Today, we also have two lovely guests that I hope you can see. The dogs are hanging out with us today. We'll see how well they behave. I'll see if I have to get rid of them. But let's go ahead and jump in. All right. So this should look familiar. This is what you used for your journal, the first part with the numbers or the math on those families. And I'm hoping what you noticed is that that first family has the most net worth. They have the most value. And then that second family is negative, and then the last family has a small net worth. I'm hoping you also notice that it's the housing or the house that is making the biggest difference for those families on their net worth. And we know that that is true for lots of families in the United States, really around the world. That's how you build your net worth because in that house, as I kind of mentioned the last time, that's how you build equity. And equity is really important in building wealth, but that can be used to help people retire, send kids to college, all that sort of stuff. So it's really, really important. If you notice that family that had negative net worth, what they were doing was not buying a house, but paying rent. Because when you pay rent, while it keeps a roof over your head every month, it doesn't help you acquire equity or that wealth piece. So it makes a really big difference. The other thing is, even though those other two families owned their house or in the process of owning their own house, one had a much bigger net worth than the other. And that's because one house was worth a lot more in the beginning than the other. So there was more room to acquire equity. So that's also an important part of this. All right. This was the second thing you're supposed to look at internalities and externalities. Which things are in our control and which things are outside of our control. And I have a feeling you probably have a mix of I's and E's on here. But I'm actually going to argue that these are all E's. These are all externalities. These are all things that are at least partially outside of our control. And I know some of you are going to be really upset with that answer. But the reason I say that is a lot of these things build on each other. So, for example, good schooling. You don't decide where you go to school when you're a kid. When you're in kindergarten, you don't tell your parents where you're going to go to school. And where we go to school or the quality of education we get helps determine where we can go to college. If you don't get most likely, if you don't get a good K-12 education, it's going to be harder for you to go to college or maybe a more desirable college. When you go to college, that's often where you build a lot of connections. So again, those things are connected. Skill set, also something you're probably going to acquire either at a trade school or college or something like that. And that is connected to these things and what your options are in these things. Okay. You might say, well, you could learn one on your own, but oftentimes if we're talking about a sport or anything like that, you're working with a coach. You are not totally in control of what that coach does. And so you see that added element of the coach that's going to help build your skill set. So even though you might be putting in hard work, that's an important part of it as well. A lot of these things are connected to some of the things we already talked about. Your economic standing is often connected to what kind of job you can get, often connected to your schooling. And I've mentioned a couple of times, owning a home in a desirable neighborhood, historically you have to be allowed to buy a house there, but it's also connected to what your financial situation is, which is again connected to a lot of these other things. Again, I know a lot of you are probably not going to like that answer, but I strongly suggest you think about that these are E's, that these are externalities. All right. Then it asks you to do a self audit. And this is really taking account of your privilege and not just along race, although you definitely see race play a part, but also economic or financial privilege and kind of how those things are tied together. So I'm hoping as you look at that, you notice that wealthy people and most likely white people are going to end up with the most points. And then vice versa, you're going to see that poor people or people without a lot of wealth are going to have least points. And you can see where race is connected to those things. And then in those questions, particularly ones about housing or law enforcement or some other ones, you might think about how your answers look different than somebody of a different race than you. And I kind of gave you an example of that the last time. Number 4, I really want to draw your attention to. It says how might wealth or family wealth provide deeper economic security than family income. I think this is a really good one historically to talk about, but also something that we're seeing right now. Our wealth is more stable than our income. We know in the last couple of weeks, over, I think the numbers right now are something like over 20, it's somewhere between like 10 and 20% of the American workforce has lost their job. So we see that it's very easy for people to lose their income. Their wealth is a little bit more stable. So those are your investments, your maybe your cars or your house or your stock or whatever's in your savings account. Those are more stable. It's harder to get rid of those. And also, if you lose your job, you can kind of hopefully use some of that wealth in that term to keep you afloat. So it's supposed to be more secure than just that income, which we think of as the amount of money that we get either monthly or yearly. All right. On the film that I asked you to watch, I'm just going to point out a couple things. I'm hoping on this question, I ask you to go back to something that you already answered about whether race is an externality, and whether it affects your ability to acquire wealth. So I'm hoping that it's obvious to see that race is an externality. We don't decide what race we're going to be. That's not in our control. And it does affect our ability to acquire wealth. I'm hoping that the film was able to convince you of that, how historically we've seen that happen. One of the things that the film talks about is something called redlining, and you can actually see that on this map right here. And this is actually a map of Sacramento. And if you are redlined, if your neighborhood is redlined, the banks and the federal government has said that this area is a bad investment, and usually they're considering it a bad investment because this is where people of color live. So if that happens, that means that you can't get a loan to buy a house there, which then turn around and means that if you had a house there, then nobody could buy your house. If you're in a green or I think a yellow, those are the next best ones. Those are places where the federal government and the banks have decided that those are good investments. Okay. So what we actually see is that the government and the banking industry in the United States is subsidizing people's wealth acquisition. What I mean by that is they're making it easier for one set of the population to acquire wealth and difficult or impossible in some situations for others. And that's going to have a generational effect. It's a really big deal. The other thing is we're seeing that real estate agents are taking advantage of people, taking advantage of people of color as well as of white Americans as well, when it comes to selling people houses and how much they're charging or how much they're claiming things are worth. And they're able to do that because there's nothing like Zillow or any of those online websites that we use now to know how much something is worth. So they're absolutely taking advantage of all sorts of people in order to make themselves wealthy. Let me see. I want to make sure I don't forget anything because this part's complicated. Okay. The other consequence of something like redlining and kind of the move to suburbia and keeping people of color, particularly African Americans, out of the suburbs is that you are keeping those people then in urban areas, particularly in apartments and things of that nature. And we know from doing our family net worth that if you are renting, you're not acquiring wealth, you're not acquiring equity. So that's again another way that they are preventing people from acquiring that sort of nest egg and that financial security that is really, really important. And this has generational effects. So long consequences for things like this. Okay? And I'm also hoping that you recognize in that film that we still see those things today. It's kind of the roots of those. So those neighborhoods that were deemed good and those neighborhoods that were deemed bad, you can still see that today. There's still a correlation between those neighborhoods today. We could definitely look at that in Sacramento or the consequences of that in Sacramento. And so in our brains, we often think that, or kind of how we're trained to think is like, if a neighborhood's not good, then those people aren't trying hard, or those people, should just take care of their property or whatever it is. And what we see is that actually those all have the roots in redlining and this process that the film covers to determine what's good and what's bad. And those are often along race lines. So it's not about people's ability, it's about opportunity. And we're talking about generations of being kept from opportunity that has long-term consequences. Right. All right. I think I got those. All right. Normally I would go over this with you guys, but I'll just let you click on it if you want to. This looks at two men who are the same age and they have the same job. So they have the same income. but it talks about how their wealth is very different and why that is. For this man right here, Max's family, they started with wealth, and they were able to help him acquire wealth. They paid for his college. They helped him put a down payment on a house and all these different things. They were financially secure, so he didn't have to worry about them in their old age. Whereas Brian didn't have any of that. His he was only able to buy a condo rather than a real house. He had to make payments. Somebody helped him with that. His parents were not in a great condition when they retired, so he always had to be ready to kind of step in and help them. So even though they made it to a point in their lives where they both had good income or good jobs, that didn't get rid of the wealth inequality between these two men. And now, even in 2020, the wealth inequality between Black America and white America is something like 2 times. So white America has 2 times the wealth of Black America. So these are very stark differences that we're still seeing today. All right, so I'm going to try and show you what this would look like. We'll see. Miss Teacher is not so tech savvy, but we're going to make it work. So I think it's really important to think about generationally what that would look like. We'll see. Bear with me. All right, so let's say these two guys right here, they just, we're talking about like post World War II, okay? This red guy right here, oh, where's my computer? All right, I think it's really important to think about what this looks like generational. So I'm going to attempt to kind of show this to you. So if we're talking about either the banking industry or the federal government made it possible for some people to acquire wealth and prevented other people from acquiring wealth. I want you to see what that looks like. Even if you want to say, Ms. Dietrich, they changed those policies, they don't do that anymore, we don't need to worry about that. I don't think that's true. So let's say we're talking post World War II, so 1950s. This red guy right here, the government's going to help subsidize his loan to buy a house. He gets a 30-year mortgage. He only has to put 20% down. This is a great opportunity for him and his family. All right, so they get to go up to this first step. Okay, this stick figure right here, government did not allow him to do that. Okay, so he does not get to buy a house. He does not get to start acquiring wealth. But you know what, Ms. Dietrich, they changed that policy. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Okay, next generation. This guy's kids, he's going to be able to help them buy a house, help put a down payment on a house, and they're going to get to go up here. More wealth for their family. Let's say this guy's kids, they were able to figure it out and take advantage, and they were able to buy a house. So they get to move up the step. All right, but then we're moving up to the next generation. This guy's kid's going to get to move up here. This guy's kid's going to get to be able to move up here. And then we're going to keep going and keep going. And so even though we got rid of this root problem right here, what we see is that there's still going to be a wealth gap between these guys right here because of something that happened right here. If we don't take advantage, or if we don't deal with the root of that wealth inequality, we're going to see it's going to grow. And what we've actually seen is wealth inequality between Black America and white America has grown since the Civil Rights Movement. So while we may have been able to make progress when it comes to civil rights or civil liberties, when it comes to economic equality, it is a major, major gap. And we can actually do the same thing looking at college, which I think is probably more applicable to you guys right now. All right, let's say these guys are the same. They both got into, I don't know, where should they go? Harvard. They're super smart. Okay. All right, my red stick figure. His family can pay for him to go to school. So when he graduates from college, he has no debt. He gets to start at the first awesome job, no debt, life is awesome. Okay. All right, our black stick figure. He also got into Yale. He had the same exact scores, his same exact experience while he was at Yale, but his family couldn't help him, so he had to take out loans. Okay. So even though they're going to graduate, they're going to get the same job, same income, all those things are the same. He's still going to start behind because he has to pay his student loans. So this guy is going to be able to start moving ahead in life before he can. Look, he gets to be able to buy a house. Okay, let's say he did real good and he was able to pay off his loans in record time. Okay, he's still behind. So let's say he gets to be able to move up here. All right, let's say he gets to move to a bigger house. Boom. He gets to buy a starter house, and et cetera, just like we did before. And so we're going to see that if we don't deal with the inequality, okay, when it comes to loans or the financial burden that we're putting on some people when it comes to student loans, that creates a gap. And we talk a lot about student loans as kind of being an equalizer. It helps people or all people be able to acquire an education, but it's more complicated than that. And we're now to the point where many Americans are in debt, have large student debt, and that is really hurting their ability to kind of move on in life, to start a family, to buy a house, to be secure. And so you have essentially wealth inequality that is growing between those kinds of people. I'm also going to argue that you're going to see this right now with coronavirus, particularly as we know that lots of people have lost their jobs. So, some of us are going to be able to work at home. And even though we don't like not being able to go out, we want to be able to go on vacation, all that good stuff, our jobs are stable. So we're right here. Okay, we can start ahead. This person, job is not secure. Maybe they lost their job, but you know what? They have some savings. They can kind of weather the storm for a little bit. All right, let's say we're everything's going great and we get to open back up again. This guy is going to have to repair his savings and all those sort of things that he had to deplete to kind of get through the crisis. This guy, economically, he's totally fine. Maybe he got to buy some new gear from Amazon. I don't know. He got some new gaming system. Life is good. Okay. So when we get out of here, he's not hurt. He actually can just keep moving. Life is just going to keep moving for this guy. This guy might take him longer for him to keep moving. Okay. To kind of repair the economic damage or the financial damage from the crisis. And that is if he had savings. In the United States, something ridiculous. I can't remember the statistics right off the top of my head, but something like the majority of Americans could not handle $1,000 crisis. So if there's some sort of an emergency that costs $1,000, they wouldn't be able to come up with that. We're in a lockdown where we have been there for almost 2 months now, and something like 20% of Americans have lost their jobs. And we don't have the reserves. We're not in financially secure situations. Many of us live paycheck to paycheck, and if those paychecks stop coming, then what do we do? And what does that mean to the people that are left here and the people who can work from home and are not financially hurt by this if we have a Great Depression, which is or a recession, which is where we're headed? So these things have long-term consequences, even if they seem short in the moment. Right. Myself. So even though redline was banned 50 years ago, we still see that there are some pretty heavy consequences. So I mentioned this earlier, but 3/4 of those neighborhoods that were redlined still continue to struggle economically today. So they're still dealing with the consequences of that. There's a lot of implications for current policies as well, which I won't get into so much today, as well as sort of the gentrification part I won't get into today. If you have questions, you want me to talk about this, I'm more than willing to. You are also still seeing that middle class white America is able to benefit from these things. So, for example, Oak Park wasn't redlined, but it is the product of redlining in a complicated way that I can explain if you want me to. But middle class America can afford, or middle class Sacramento can afford to live there. And so you see lots of middle class white Americans like Miss Dietrich moving in and pushing other people out. So still dealing with the consequences of that. It's something that I wrestle with all the time, whether I should live here and things of that nature. All right. The other thing is the film is really focused on Black Americans, but it's other groups as well that get redlined: Catholics, Jews, Latinos, Asians, Southern Europeans, and other immigrants. So even though that's kind of the focus and the brunt of it is going to go to Black Americans, you still see that happen to other groups as well, particularly geographically. So if we think about in California, particularly in Southern California, you're going to see that happen more to Latinos than African Americans. So just to kind of keep that in mind. Just another example to show you that these things aren't dead and gone, that this is still affecting us. This was actually after the last recession, so in 2008. We're going to want to look at this in the next couple of years after, as a consequences of COVID as well. But what you see is that white Americans have a much higher rate of home ownership than others. So again, you're still seeing kind of the repercussions of preventing some people from being able to buy a house. All right. But again, Miss Drake, who cares? It's just housing. Who cares? This happened a long time ago. It's not just economic either, it's also health. So when we look at it, higher levels of asthma in these communities, as well as some of the harsh effects of climate change or climate crisis, particularly when we're talking about heat or hotness, is linked to those neighborhoods as well. And then these, I kind of talked about college loans a second ago, and COVID today. And then this is just another article about sort of the consequences of this. All right. I want to make it really clear that I'm not saying if you're white, you don't deserve to be successful or that hard work doesn't mean anything. I'm absolutely not saying that. I think these are hard things to talk about. If you, particularly as a junior, and you're really stressing, you want your grades to be really high, you're thinking about where you can go to college, and you're thinking, I'm working so hard, I deserve these things. I'm not at all saying that you don't. But I am saying that we want to make sure that we are conscious of our privilege. And if somebody is not as successful as you, I don't want you to be like, well, they're not working that hard. I want you to really think about kind of the institutionalized things that make things both complicated and hard. And I'm not saying don't try hard either. I am saying try hard, but I'm saying we need to make sure that we understand the behind the scenes stuff or the complexities of this and really checking our assumptions about other people as we go forward. I'll also tell you that when I was your age, I would not have bought any of this. I very much thought I need to work hard and I deserve everything I get. And I think now I have had more life experiences and I think things are far more complicated than that. All right. This is just one of the other journal entries you have that I just want to make sure it's very clear when you're talking about the nation or the trenches. The nation is the government. So those are the people in the government. So the president, Congress, the Supreme Court, maybe a governor, some part of the state government. And so I think about what their role is to either make laws, to execute laws, to determine if they're constitutional. Okay. So you have that part of making change, right? So a law would change things. But then you have the trenches, and that's the people. And so I want you to think about how they create change. How do they push society to change? And how often do they push against government to kind of make that change? So we'll talk about lots of examples. But let's see, let's talk about the bus boycott, since that's what we looked at last time. So you see both the nation and the trenches in the bus boycott. So if we think about the trenches, those are all those activists. That's Rosa Parks. That's all those women. All those people that are doing a carpool or walking to work today. They are the trenches. They are trying to create change on the ground. The part of the nation that we see in that is going to be the Supreme Court that will ultimately say that the buses need to integrate. And so you see the push-pull kind of factor on that. So as we kind of go through this unit, I want you to really think about where do you see the government playing a role and where do you see the people playing a role and how do you see the people that are pushing on the government. And again, this is going to be part of your assessment, so you really want to make sure that you're clear on that. So ask all the questions you want about that one because it's important. Another journal I just want to point out, this is Bayard Rustin. He is a pretty cool activist that for a long time didn't get the attention that he deserved. And part of the reason that he didn't get all of the attention he deserved is he has what I consider three strikes, or what I refer to as three strikes. He is not only an African-American activist, he's also gay, talking 1950s and on, some amount of time where that is socially acceptable. And he's also a communist. So 3 strikes. So even though he's behind the scenes in a lot of this activism, oftentimes he's not allowed to play an upfront role, or not kind of being allowed to be out in the open about things and kind of his role. Even though he's doing really big things like organizing the March on Washington and things of that nature. He's also a really interesting person because he is actually the man that convinces Martin Luther King to be nonviolent in the way that we think of him today. In the early days of MLK's activism, he actually carried guns with him all the time. In his cars, in his house, Bayard Rustin tells a story about sitting on a couch, or going to sit on a couch in MLK's house. And so he goes, whoa, don't sit there, because there were guns all in the couch. And Bayard Rustin really says, like, you can't do this. Like, if you want to be successful, you have to do it the nonviolent way. And really getting MLK to think about kind of Gandhi's philosophy and the nonviolence approach that we see today. So, kind of an interesting person. You're going to read this article, and then I want you to think about, how do we remember this guy? He is involved in all sorts of things for the rest of his life, not just African American civil rights, and so fascinating stories. At one point in my life, I had to write a poem about him as well. And so if you want to look at that, you're more than welcome to. It's right there. He has a long, interesting, full life. So he's a pretty cool guy.
All right. Content-wise, we left off talking about the Montgomery bus boycotts last lecture. And now we're going to kind of talk about how from the Montgomery bus boycotts, we kind of see what we know as the civil rights movement kind of take off. So from that, we're going to see that movement again take shape. It's a picture of an early march or protest that you see. And you can see MLK right here with Coretta Scott King. All right. And what we see in this freedom movement is the creation of some of these early organizations or groups. So SCLC is going to be born out of the Montgomery bus boycott. CORE is actually founded earlier, or the Congress of Racial Equality, and they'll play an early role, and then we won't talk about them as much later. And then this is going to be a really important one. It's called SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They're a really interesting one. They're doing a lot of the, I would say, the hard, dangerous work, also some of the boring organizing work, which we'll talk about why that's actually really necessary. And two of the strategies that they're using are nonviolent protest, so direct action, and then jail without bail. So nonviolent protest you might think of as your marches or your sit-in movements. Sometimes the tactic of jail without bail is essentially filling up the jails and taking up space in a community to try and get your message out or force them to kind of reckon with what it is that you are protesting. I am going to read this quote to you. It's from Diane Nash, who is an organizer from SNCC. And this is her in the very front. And she is a firecracker, and I will explain to you why in just a second. But she says of her organizing, this will be a Black boy born in Mississippi, and thus wherever he is born, he will be in prison. If I go to jail now, it may help hasten that day when my child and all children will be free. So essentially, she's willing to go to jail or put herself in harm's way now, so that her children or the next generation will have it better, that they will live in what she calls freedom. All right. So from there, we see some of this early grassroots movements, and we see that in the sit-in movement. So these four boys are in Greensboro, North Carolina. They are some of the earliest activists to do what is known as our sit-in movement. It's kind of an interesting story. They're four college boys. There had been some organizing done by women and another group that was essentially trying to train activists before they did this. But these four boys are impatient, so they decide they're going to do it before the rest of their peers or the rest of the activists going to get behind them. So they're doing this at a store called Woolworths, and they're sitting down at this counter. These boys are really interesting. They're pretty smart. Woolworths is a department store, maybe like a Nordstrom's or something like we have today, where it has a department store and there's also like a cafe. And so these boys know that they can go into the store part, so the department store part, and they can make purchases. But they're not allowed to sit at the counter at the cafe. But they want to make a point. So they take their purchases from the department store side and they sit at the counter with their purchases in their lap, in their bags in their lap, essentially, or with them. And they want to make the point that their money is good in part of the business, but not in the other part, to kind of point out how ridiculous it is that they will not be served. So they're not served at this moment in time. They are removed. Nonviolently, it's a pretty calm event, this very first one. But this is going to start a movement. So from this first sit-in, one of the first sit-ins, we're going to see it expand across the nation. A lot in the South, but across the nation. This is a picture of where those boys are. And I can't remember if they're sitting right here or right here, but this is the actual counters where they were sitting. It's a museum now. You can go through it in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then this is not from the actual sit-in movement, but this is an important thing, or kind of just showing one of the things that's going on, and it's also in the same museum. So this Coke machine was used at like a train station. And so where this wall is, you would have had like the white waiting room and then the colored waiting room, which is the term they would have used at that time. And they were different prices. So on the colored side, it would be more expensive to buy a Coke than it is on the white side. But you would never have known that. So it's just one small way of creating inequality that people wouldn't have realized was happening, but was absolutely happening. All right, so the sit-in movement, it is going to grow and grow and grow. It's a lot of young people. I'm not going to read this to you, but I'll kind of explain what she's talking about. So a lot of young people, a lot of college students that are doing these sit-in movements. This is a pretty famous picture. So you have some college students, both black and white, and I think this is actually a professor, if I remember correctly. And then you have all these people behind them that are harassing them essentially as they are trying to protest the inequality of not being able to sit at the lunch counter. So oftentimes the students would bring their homework or something to try and focus on while this was happening, to try and focus on that rather than kind of the crowd behind them. And all sorts of terrible things would happen to them. They'd be pushed, they'd be shoved, things would be thrown at them, poured on them. You can see something being poured on them right now, hot coffee. Sometimes they would get hit with things like brass knuckles and then salt poured on the wounds and all those sort of things. And they are trained, or they're supposed to be trained in nonviolence, because I want you to think about, close your eyes and think about if all those things were happening to you, and whether somebody was trying to physically remove you and in so many ways cause you harm, could you sit there and not respond? Because they have to not respond. They have to, again, have that courage to sit there nonviolently and to put up with it. Because the reason that this is really powerful is images like this are showing that these protesters are sitting there peacefully, that they are not moving. And so it is putting this bad image on those who are responding, who are there pouring things on them and harassing them. The other thing I want you to see is in the background, there are two men that are wearing sunglasses. These are actually FBI agents. This is just one of many, 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 many examples of where the FBI is present. They are watching, or in some cases infiltrating, what it is that is happening, but they are not actually protecting people. Okay? They are watching this happen, but they are in no way stepping in and helping and protecting the safety of these people. All right. This is a picture of Judy Richardson. Well, lots of pictures of Judy Richardson, who was an early activist in SNCC. She was a field secretary, if I remember correctly. And she is at all sorts of events. So this is her right here at one of the sit-in movements. This is actually a picture of her giving us a lecture. I met her a couple years ago at a professional development thing. And she's pointing to a picture of herself, which I think is pretty cool. And this is just me being very excited about meeting her. She is one of the women that is behind the documentary Eyes on the Prize, so that massive documentary in the 1980s and 90s that she put together to make sure that we understood the civil rights movement. She's also very much a firecracker. She was a secretary in an office with a very, very famous leader, and I can't remember which one on the top of my head, but she did not believe that he was treating the women correctly. So they staged a sit-in within the SNCC office. So even within the civil rights movement, she was holding her own movement. So she's a pretty awesome lady. All right, I want you to take a second to think about how you get yourself home safely. Particularly, my ladies, do you do anything special to make sure you get home safely? Do you make sure you're talking on the phone, that you have something with you, you don't go by yourself? All those different things that we as women maybe take special precautions to do. I mentioned that because at this time, from really not all the 1900s, but the first half of the 1900s, this edition right here is from 1940, lots of African Americans would use what is called the Green Book. And this book you could buy at a gas station or something like that. And it would be a list of all the places that was safe for African Americans to stop in the country. This is a time where, particularly in certain parts of the country or certain cities, it is dangerous for African Americans to go for fear or intimidation or violence that they might feel from white America. And so this is to kind of help them travel safely. You can get a copy of it. I have a copy that I would normally pass out to you, and it has lots of places, obviously more in the South where you would need that, but also other places in the country. Sacramento is listed on there. There's 2 places in Sacramento. And then where this little dot is where this restaurant, the Dunlap restaurant, used to be. It's still there. It's not a restaurant anymore. But there's a historical marker on there. So just if you're interested. Greenbrick was also the name of a movie. This is a picture from the movie a couple years ago. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. You're free to watch it if you want. It's interesting. I don't think it did what it was supposed to. Greenbrick is supposed to help essentially empower African Americans and keep them safe as they travel. And instead, this kind of turned into more of like a white savior movie. Like it's this guy figuring out how terrible racism is. But at the end of the day, all he's doing is getting this man, this famous musician, safely across the South. And so it's less about like the empowerment of African Americans protecting themselves and more about this guy. But it's out there if you're interested. All right, but this leads us to what's known as the Freedom Rides. So the Freedom Rides are going to be rides on buses by young activists. So it started by CORE, and then it's going to get taken over by SNCC. So CORE and then SNCC, which are the students. And they're going to start up here, and then they're going to try and go into the Deep South. These are the paths, and then I'll show you one in color in just a second. The reason they're doing that is we know from the Montgomery bus boycotts that the Supreme Court said that segregated busing and then waiting rooms, etc., is unconstitutional. Can't do that. But that doesn't mean that that's being enforced or that people are following that. So these activists want to get that enforced. They want the ICC or the Interstate Commerce something to enforce the law. And so they're trying to push this issue, and they're also trying to push the civil rights movement into the Deep South. Okay. So this is something that we would have done in class, but this is just kind of showing you their path. So CORE is going to start it, and they're going to start, again, up in D.C., and they're going to go down here. But then they get stopped. They meet quite a bit of violence. They meet the KKK and some pretty horrific things around here. So they're going to give up, essentially. And Diane Nash and SNCC, which is a bunch of young college students, they say, no, we are not giving into violence. We are not going to let them win. So students and Diane Nash are going to do this trip, and then they're going to go this way. And then there'll be some other ones. There's actually people from across the country that will come and meet and do these freedom rides with them. They are pretty incredible. Many of these young kids, college students, they know that they're going to face lots of harm. They write their will before they leave because they know it's possible that they will die. And this is not only Black activists, but also white activists. And some of the white activists talk about that they recognize that they might actually take the brunt of the violence in certain situations. And that's because they're seen as race traitors. And so they are brutally beat up. In some places, the media is beat up too, or harassed too, because it's the idea of if you stop media from taking pictures, then does anybody know what actually happened? There's a movie called Freedom Riders that I strongly suggest you watch. It's pretty incredible. But one of the stories that they talk about is, so the activists are part of the people on the bus, but they're not all the people on the bus. They're just regular riders and the bus driver who's not involved. And when they get to, I believe it's Anniston, this first group of riders, they are there, and there's somebody that's like laying in the middle of the road. And so obviously the bus has to stop because you can't run somebody over. That's bad. And when that happens, other people come out and they slash the tires on the bus. So the bus can't go anywhere. And then it gets surrounded by a mob. The people on the bus don't want to leave because that's dangerous. You don't want to go out into a mob that wants to cause you harm. So then they throw Molotov cocktails into the bus, which is essentially fire into the bus. Well, then when the bus is on fire, then all of them have to get off into this mob who means to cause them harm. And so it's this very horrific and terrifying event that causes harm to not only the activists, but also regular riders and the bus driver as well. And so it proves to these activists and to the world really how violent and dangerous what it is that they're doing. And again, all they are trying to get is their human dignity, that they are equal human beings and they should not, yes, be segregated on a bus, but it's about more than that. And again, they are nonviolent and they are facing a lot of violence. In reality, though, that's one of the reasons that the nonviolence methods work, is because what you're trying to do is to provoke people to violence or into action, because then the image of violence being thrown against nonviolence is a way of kind of proving your point that something is very, very wrong. I'm just going to point this out. One of the activists that is part of the Freedom Rides is this man named John Lewis. John Lewis is this young gentleman right here, and one of his many mugshots for all of his activist work. He was at almost all of these major events. He was not only a freedom rider and a SNCC leader, he is actually a member of Congress right now, and he has been since the 1980s. I won't go into it, but you can imagine the current president does not think highly of John Lewis. And then these are some of the other photos of John Lewis at that time. This guy right here, which I'm covering, this is Bull Connor. He is one of the most feared men in the South. He is the Commissioner of Public Safety of the city of Birmingham, which is so violent at that moment in time towards African Americans that it is nicknamed Bombingham. And much of that was perpetuated or supported by the Commissioner of Public Safety. And you can tell that there's only some people's safety he cares about. Last thing I'll just point out, John Lewis actually has cancer right now. So our time with John Lewis is limited. And so he is a national treasure. So I encourage you to think about or do some digging on Mr. John Lewis's life. All right. So this is just kind of a reminder for us that nonviolence direct action, so what we see in the activism that we've already seen, is all about bringing what was happening in the shadows forward. Like, African Americans in the South are very aware of what racism looks like in the South and what is happening. But people want to pretend that that's not happening, or it's not as bad as you say it is, et cetera, et cetera. So by forcing that violence into the open, you are forcing America to reckon with who we are and what it is that we are allowing to happen. So force us to think about these things. And just a reminder that law enforcement's job is to protect the status quo. And at this moment in time, it's Jim Crow laws, it's segregation, it's white supremacy, and law enforcement is doing a really good job of that. Last thing on here is talking about women. In lots of these instances, you actually see women, oftentimes even with babies in their arms, yelling and cursing and screaming at activists. And so they are helping to maintain the status quo. It's not just like white men that are perpetuating this sort of violence and lawlessness and very vile racism. It is the Southern, not just Southern, but white women that are also very much helping to perpetuate this. All right, so from there, one of the things that we see is that the civil rights movement will move to Albany, Georgia. This is actually a failure for MLK. This is MLK right here, and this is the police chief or commissioner, Lori Pritchett. And the reason that this is a failure is I mentioned that one of the reasons that nonviolence works is because you are pressing the issue or forcing the issue in a community. Essentially, you're trying to get all up in the white community and make them uncomfortable so that they respond the way that you know that they will when the media is not looking. But if you can't get them to respond, if there's no reaction or there's no violence and there's nothing for the media to put on the front page of the newspaper. And Lori Pritchett knows this. So he is able to keep his community in control so that they don't respond to MLK's activism. And he also works with the surrounding communities to make sure that there is jail space available to put all the activists. So the tactic of filling up the jails isn't going to work. So unfortunately, MLK's tactics don't work in Albany. So he's going to leave Albany and he's going to move in a second to a different city. I'm trying to keep this in chronological order, which you don't need to remember, but I think it's just kind of important. So kind of in between the Albany movement, you see the integration of higher ed start. We talked about Brown v. Board of Education, which is just K-12, but then there's going to be efforts to put that into college as well. But much like we saw the violence, the resistance at the K-12 level, you see the same thing happen at the college level. James Meredith is one of the first people to integrate higher ed. Make sure you kind of keep his name in the back of your mind because he will come back and be important in a little bit. This is the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who we mentioned a couple times. He was not only a staunch segregationist and an overall jerk, he also ran for president of the United States and was a third-party candidate in 68. And then he will run again in 72, but somebody actually tries to assassinate him, and he is paralyzed for the rest of his life. I'll let you do with what you want with that piece of information. All right, so MLK is going to go from the failure in Albany to Birmingham, which he's hoping to get a win or a success in Birmingham. And at the end, it will be, but it definitely does not start like that for MLK. Again, Birmingham is nicknamed as Bombingham because of the amount of violence that African Americans feel in this city and the amount of intimidation and discrimination in this city. And that's also with the leadership of somebody named Bull Connor, so the public safety commissioner. So MLK comes to Birmingham. He's going to try the tactics that he used in other cities. He's going to try and use jail without bail. And so he does. He gets arrested, but he is one of very few people that are willing to do this. These adults in Birmingham feel that they have too much to lose, so they don't really want to get involved. And so that's creating two problems. One, there's going to be some criticism of MLK, that things aren't going well, or maybe you should be doing something different, MLK. And then also for MLK, his tactic isn't working. So he needs to figure out what will make Birmingham successful. But before we get to what makes Birmingham successful, let's actually look at part of his letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I know some of you have done or will do this in English classes this term, which I think is great. But I want to make sure that there's a couple parts of it that we're pretty clear about. So he's in jail. Local, or at least white clergymen around the country, is probably more likely, are going to say, MLK, we think that you need to be doing something different. Maybe you need to go slower. Whatever you're doing is not working. We need to do something else. And this is his response. So remember that he is a religious leader. That was his first job, and then the civil rights came second. So this is essentially white clergymen, white religious leaders talking to a black clergyman or religious leader about what he's doing. And so this is his response. I pulled out a couple quotes that I think are important. The top two might sound familiar to you, and then we'll get to some other ones. So the first one is, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So it's the idea of that if something wrong is happening in the world or where you are or in the country or whatever, it's a threat to justice anywhere. And so maybe you don't feel the repercussions of that moment or those injustices at that moment, but they could come for you. It's essentially the same idea that we talked about with the Holocaust. The first they came for. So first they came for the Jews, and I did nothing because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody to step up for me. And so it's sort of the same idea that you do it because it is good for all humanity, or you care about it because it's good for all humanity. And then he says one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And he's talking about segregation laws. And so this is something I pointed out at the very beginning of this unit, or your intro lecture, that laws don't mean moral, or they don't mean just. They are the status quo. They are the way things are. And sometimes the right thing to do is to not follow those. And he gives the example of Hitler. He says, we can never forget that everything that Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything that the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. So again, there's a difference between what is right or what is moral and what is legal sometimes. And then he gets into this part, this long quote that I'll read to you, that I think is probably the most important of what he says. And I think it's really important because it's the thing that haunts me. It's the thing that I think we need to be conscious of at all times when it comes to change and what it takes to make change. So he says, over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens, counselor, or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. But I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. What he's essentially saying is it's not the extremes, it's not the radicals, it's not people running around in white hoods and white sheets. It's the moderate, it's those people in the middle that are okay with the status quo, who say, like, yeah, you're facing injustice, but like, worry about that later, or go slower, or do it when it's more convenient for me. It's those moderates that help perpetuate the status quo, who say your issues are not that big of a deal, or don't inconvenience me. And so if we're thinking about more current things, these are those people that were unhappy about protesters who shut down Kings games or the freeway after Stephon Clark's shooting. Because don't inconvenience me. Don't get in the way of me going to a basketball or me going out to dinner or me getting home in a timely manner. Those things are more important than somebody's life. And so he's pointing out those things. It's those of us who live our daily life and don't want to be inconvenienced or don't want to go to the trouble to demand dignity or human rights for others because it would in some way get in the way of our daily life. I think for me, it's a really good thing to think about, where are you being a white moderate? Where am I being a white moderate? Where am I willing to put up with the status quo because it's easier on me? And it's necessary to kind of take a hard look at ourselves and understand that at many points of our life, and lots of us are being the white moderate, in that we are not doing the radical things that would create change. And so what we're saying instead is that we are okay with the way that it is. And we should be concerned about that. All right. So he writes that letter. He still cannot get the adult of Birmingham behind this. So the people who step up are children. And these children who are willing to risk their lives in Birmingham to protest against Bull Connor are anywhere from the age of 3 to high schoolers. 3 years old to high schoolers that are going to march by the thousands and the thousands and thousands to shut down the city of Birmingham. And this is where those famous scenes of the dogs being used on children or protesters, as well as the fire hoses being used on protesters, come from. And again, those are being used on children. Children. So your siblings, your family friends, the people that you babysit, as well as kids your age. That is what's happening to them, all because they would like human rights, all because they don't want to live in segregated cities. They want the same opportunities as others. And it is the children that win, because those images of those little kids being sprayed or hurt or bit by dogs is going to play across TV screens and newspapers across the country. And this is in 1963, so this is when Kennedy is in office, this is before he's assassinated. And he has had enough. And so this is where you start to see legislation and the Kennedy administration start formulating ways to get rid of segregation on a larger scale, not just on buses, not just on transportation, but in life in general. And it is children that do it. And I think that that's an incredibly powerful thing, that these children are willing to put their lives on the line because they know, kind of like Diane Nash said earlier, if they don't, their lives will continue to be in jeopardy. If they live in the violence that Birmingham or Birmingham continues to perpetuate against Black bodies, that will continuously be their life. And so if they can do the very scary thing and create change, that's a really big deal. And again, I cannot emphasize it enough that it is children that are willing to do this. It's not their parents who are too worried about their economic or their financial situation, who are too afraid about what it would mean if they stepped out of line, if they challenged the system. So it's children. But unfortunately, sometimes we don't always move forward. Sometimes we take a step back. And we see that with Medgar Evers, who had been a very effective leader of the NAACP for a long time. And he's actually gunned down. He's assassinated in front of his house and his wife and with his children nearby. And so it's this moment, one of many, many moments where the violence or the racial violence in the South is out in the open, and you cannot deny what it is that is happening, which I think highlights the necessity of organizing, that it is literally life and death for people. But the other thing is that for many of them, they are going to give up their life to fight for something better than what they are living with at that moment in time. But then we take a step forward. We see that with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedoms. And so it is one of the largest single day marches in history. There's about 250,000 people that show up. And while we often boil it down just to King's I Have a Dream speech, it's much larger than that. Literally much larger with the sheer number of people, but also just logistically much larger than that. He is one of the last people to perform, last people to go. And that part, the I Have a Dream part, is an off the cuff. It's something that came from his heart at that moment. And it's an incredible thing that he's able to do. But we'll talk about why it's a little bit more complicated than just that speech. But I also want to point out that they're not just marching for freedoms. They're not just marching for civil rights. They are marching for jobs. And so I point that out because they're recognizing that along with civil rights or civil liberties, it's also about economic rights and economic security and creating economic opportunity. So they're pretty clear that there are lots of issues that need to be worked on. All right, so how do you organize a march like this? Well, it takes a long time. This is A. Philip Randolph, and you might have remembered him from term one or first time together. He is the one that forces FDR to desegregate the defense industry. He essentially threatens FDR and says, if you don't do this, I'm going to march on Washington. There's a couple versions of the story, but that's essentially what happens. And so this kind of plan for a march on Washington had been around for decades. But they're going to pick it up in the 1960s because they're essentially trying to force legislation or force Congress to do something about civil rights. And so if they can get this event to go off non-violent and a large number of people, that's one step closer to getting Congress to do something about segregation. That's much larger than just what's happening with transportation. So the person that's actually in charge, or kind of the organizer, sorry about that, behind the scenes is this guy right here. And he might look familiar to you because that is Bayard Rustin. And so he's the guy that I talked about was helping in the Montgomery bus boycotts, and you have to read about for one of your journals, who is not only African-American, but also gay and a communist. And so even though in this instance he's doing the work behind the scenes on the march, he's not the face of it. He's not allowed to kind of be out in the open about that. There are actually two other people that the FBI says has to leave because they're too radical, and the organizer actually do ask them to leave. Okay. Just a reminder: this is on the heels of the Birmingham campaign, so the Children's March, Medgar Evers' assassination, as well as a speech that JFK gave about the need for legislation around this. And the organizers know that the stakes are really high because if something happens, if there is any sort of violence or any hitch in this program, the movement's done. This is their one-time shot to have a massive unified event, and it has to go off. And it does, which is pretty incredible. And so you see all these organizations together. So you see SNCC, you see CORE, these are some labor organizers, you see SCLC. And so they're all able to come together, which is actually a really big deal because you would think that they're all fighting for Black civil rights. And so they would all get along. But that's not true. There's a lot of infighting behind the scenes. There's a lot of disagreements about how things should work or how the movement should go or what their priorities should be. So just to give you one example of that. So John Lewis right here. We talked about him earlier with the Freedom Rides, but he wants to go on stage and give this super radical or what's considered super radical speech at that time. And the rest of the organizers was like, oh, no, buddy, you can't go out and do that. You can't do that. And so they're fighting up until the very last moment that he goes out on the stage. So they get him to tone it down enough that he is able to go on stage. There are a whole bunch of musicians and celebrities there, like the people of the time show up to this event. Somebody even uses their private jet to fly people into the event to make sure that it is a studded deal. All right. But we always come to MLK's speech at the very end. You can see he's one of the last people. I have a dream that someday my children will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And the reason that I want to talk about this is I'm not in any way want to take away from the power of MLK and his speaking abilities. or that came from the heart, that it wasn't something that he had planned. But that line gets misused. It gets misused because it's essentially talking about a colorblind society. And if we're talking about a colorblind society, people use that to be like, oh, I don't see race. Race is not a thing. It's not a problem anymore. I'm beyond that. And I think that's wrong, and it's problematic for two reasons. Number one, we're misusing MLK. We're misusing his legacy because that's not actually what he means by that. What he is talking about is actual true equality or equity, where his children have equal opportunity in society. Not that they're not seen for who they are, but who they are does not prevent them from being successful or having opportunity. But we often use that to pretend that history didn't happen. So we often say, oh, I don't see race, so race is not a problem. And we pretend that 400 years of history that tells us that race absolutely was a problem and was used to justify horrific things does not exist. So we want to make sure that we're being really careful when, A, we're going to use somebody's words, that we actually understand who that person is and what they mean, but also that we are talking about honest history. All right. The last thing, actually, I'll point out two things. Number one, this is a song really talking about how we have not lived up to our legacy or our obligation in America. And so it's called Check Cashing Day. So essentially, America owes people a check, not as in like cash money necessary, but there's a debt that is owed. It's a pretty good spoken word piece if you're interested. And the last thing I want to point out on here, there's a part on here that is for the widows. Oh, right here. So it says a tribute to Negro women fighters for freedom, but many of them are people who have lost their husbands or their spouses to the movement, to just kind of give you an idea of the number of people that are dying because of their activism, because they demand their human rights. All right. But then, of course, we move backwards. So in the wake of the March on Washington, we see the church bombing in Birmingham. So Birmingham, again, is very fittingly named Birmingham. And when this church is bombed, these 4 girls will die. Do we hold people accountable? Of course not. The other thing I want to point out is this church had been the scene of organizing for years, since the 1950s and earlier than that. But in many of the civil rights events that we've talked about, a lot of the organizing and the planning had been happening here. So it's not only the terrible death of these 4 girls, but also the destruction of this community center and this place for change and organizing. Also, there are 2 people that live in Birmingham that this will drastically change who they, well, for anybody really that lives in Birmingham, but definitely for these 2 women. Angela Davis will ultimately join the Black Panthers and goes a very radical way. And she is famous for being militaristic and very aggressive. And she despises when people ask her about violence because she says, who are you to talk to me about violence? Like, this is my childhood. This is what I lived through. I lived through Birmingham. I know violence. I know when violence is perpetuated against me. What I'm talking about is self-defense, and that's different. That's protecting myself so that I don't end up like this. The other person is Condoleezza Rice, which you were probably less familiar with, but she was a big name in the Bush Jr. administration in his foreign policy. And her family leaves. They flee Birmingham after the death of these 4 girls, and they move to Colorado. And I can only imagine the sort of influence this childhood had on who she became later. She's an interesting person that you might take some time to look at. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop it there, and we will pick up with things next time. All right. See you all later.